They shut the door on him until Morgan Freeman stepped in to save it. The security guard barely looked up as an older man approached the glass doors of Hudson & Coars, one of the top entertainment firms in the city. "Sorry, sir, employees only." The man paused, his expression unreadable. The guard had no idea. He had just blocked the company's most important investor. Does respect come from power or character? Comment 1 for character, 0 for power. Morgan Freeman had built an empire of wisdom, experience, and quiet power. But as he stood at the entrance of Hudson & Company, watching the young security guard dismiss him without a second thought, he was reminded of something. Respect isn't given to those who deserve it. It's given to those who are assumed to be powerful. And today, he wasn't assumed to be anything at all. "I have a meeting," Morgan said calmly. The guard sighed, tapping his clipboard, impatient, dismissive. "Look, sir, we have a policy. Unless you have an employee badge or an appointment on record, I can't let you in." Morgan nodded slowly. "Then check the record." The guard rolled his eyes, typing lazily into his computer. Morgan waited. A few passing employees stole glances at him, some barely concealing their amusement. A well-dressed executive whispered to an assistant, "Who let someone's grandpa wander in?" Morgan heard everything. He said nothing. Then, the guard's face changed. The lazy smirk vanished. His eyes flicked to the screen, then back up at Morgan. "Wait, Mr. Freeman?" Morgan smiled. "Yes, and now are you going to let me in, or do I need to buy the building first?" Because in exactly 5 minutes, the entire company was about to learn who they had just insulted. The moment the security guard's fingers hovered over the keyboard, Morgan Freeman already knew how this would go. He had seen it before. The assumptions, the dismissal, the quiet arrogance of people who thought power only came in expensive suits and youthful faces. And as expected, the guard barely glanced at the screen before scoffing. "Sir, there's no record of a meeting for, you." The hesitation in his voice was brief, but Morgan caught it. The guard wasn't entirely sure, but rather than double-check, he chose to assume. And assumptions had consequences. Morgan adjusted his coat, his movements slow, deliberate. "That's odd," he said calmly, "because I was personally invited by your CEO." The guard's lips twitched, not with respect, but amusement. "Sir, a lot of people say that." Behind them, a sleek black sports car pulled up, and a sharply dressed man in his early 40s stepped out. Ethan Cole, the CEO of Hudson & Company. The very man who had called Morgan just days ago asking for his help. The guard straightened immediately. "Mr. Cole, sir. Good morning." Ethan barely acknowledged him, his phone pressed to his ear, his expensive watch glinting under the sunlight. Morgan took a step forward. "Ethan." Ethan paused mid-stride, finally glancing up, and his reaction said it all. First, surprise, then realization, and finally something close to panic. "Morgan, I didn't know you'd be here so early." Morgan smiled slightly. "Apparently neither did your staff." The security guard, still unaware of the gravity of his mistake, watched the exchange with growing unease. Nearby, a small group of junior executives stood frozen, their whispers barely concealed. "Wait, is that... No way. The Morgan Freeman? Why is he here?" Ethan, regaining composure, forced a laugh. "Let's get you inside, Morgan. We have a lot to discuss." Morgan didn't move. Instead, he turned back to the guard. "Before we do that, perhaps your employee here should reconsider how he handles guests." The guard paled. Ethan's jaw clenched. Now the entire office was watching. And Morgan? He had all the time in the world. Ethan forced a smile, stepping between them. "Morgan, let's not make a big deal out of this. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Morgan tilted his head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" He turned back to the guard. "Tell me, son, what exactly did you assume when I walked up to you?" The guard swallowed hard. I just thought you were..." Morgan held up a hand. "No need to explain. I already know." The weight of those words hung in the air, because suddenly it wasn't just about the security guard, it wasn't just about one mistake, It was about the entire culture of the company. Morgan took a slow breath. "This is why I'm here, Ethan. This company doesn't have a business problem." He glanced at the employees still whispering behind their desks. "It has a leadership problem." Ethan stiffened, because Morgan wasn't just talking about the guard anymore. Morgan finally stepped forward, past the security desk, past Ethan, past the murmuring employees. "Let's get inside," he said. "We have a lot to fix." The security guard had made a mistake, but soon the entire company would realize they were the ones who needed saving. The air inside Hudson & Company felt heavier than it had moments ago. Employees who had barely noticed Morgan Freeman before were now stealing wide-eyed glances as he walked past them. The whispers grew louder. The ones who had chuckled at him earlier now exchanged nervous glances. They had misjudged him. And worse, they had done it in front of the one man who now had the power to change everything. Ethan Cole led Morgan through the glass-paneled executive floor, trying to maintain his usual air of control. But the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he walked just a little too fast, it told Morgan everything he needed to know. "Morgan, I really didn't expect you so early," Ethan said, forcing a smile. Morgan chuckled, his deep voice calm but deliberate. "You invited me here, Ethan. I assumed you meant what you said on the phone." Ethan hesitated, because Morgan wasn't wrong. Just 3 days ago, Ethan had called him, almost desperate. "The company is struggling. We need fresh capital, new leadership, someone with experience to help guide us out of this mess." Morgan had listened, considered, then agreed to invest millions into saving Hudson & Company. And now, he was standing in the middle of a company that didn't even recognize the man about to save them. As they reached the conference room, the entire executive team was already seated. Some were mid-conversation, some were checking their phones, and then Morgan stepped inside. Silence. Conversations cut short. A few executives, not yet realizing who he was, barely acknowledged him. One of them, Matthew Klein, head of corporate finance, frowned. "Ethan, who is this?" he asked. Ethan cleared his throat. "This is Mr. Morgan Freeman." A pause. Then Matthew scoffed, shaking his head. "Okay, and why is he in this meeting?" Ethan hesitated. Morgan didn't. He pulled out the portfolio he had brought with him, placed it on the long mahogany table, and flipped it open. Page after page of financial records, restructuring plans, and investment proposals. Then, without even looking up, he said, "Because I now own 35% of this company." The reaction was instant. A few gasps, a few nervous coughs. Matthew stiffened. Emily Carter, head of talent relations, leaned forward in disbelief. "Wait, what?" Morgan finally looked up, his gaze steady. "I said I own 35% of Hudson & Company, which means," he glanced around, pausing for effect, "I now have the power to decide what happens next." The silence was deafening. Gone was the smug confidence that had filled the room moments ago. Because now they realized the man they had ignored, dismissed, and laughed at was the one signing their paychecks. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Morgan, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Of course, we appreciate your investment, but..." Morgan held up a hand. "No need for explanations, Ethan." He leaned back in his chair, looking around the table. "I don't need apologies. I don't need excuses." His voice dropped slightly, steady and controlled. "I just need to know, is this a company worth saving?" The weight of the question hung over them, because for the first time, every person in that room understood. Morgan wasn't just here as an investor. He was here as the new decision maker, and the fate of Hudson & Company was now entirely in his hands. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words settled over the room like a thick fog. The executives, once confident and dismissive, now sat rigid and uneasy, because in just a few sentences Morgan had taken control, not by force, not by intimidation, but by the sheer, undeniable power of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And now, it was time to fix the mess they had created. Morgan tapped the financial reports in front of him. "I've read every report, every projection, every proposal," he said, "and I see the same problem everywhere." He lifted his gaze. This company doesn't have a talent issue. It has a culture issue. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Morgan didn't let up. Tell me, how do you expect to run a company that thrives on relationships when you can't even treat people with basic respect? Silence. Emily Carter, still recovering from the shock of his presence, opened her mouth to protest. Morgan didn't give her the chance. Starting today, we're implementing a full-scale cultural overhaul. His tone was steady, unyielding. Every single employee, executives included, will go through professional conduct training. Someone scoffed. Matthew Klein, head of finance, shook his head. Morgan, this is a business, not a social experiment. Morgan leaned forward. And that attitude is exactly why this business is failing. Matthew paled. Because Morgan wasn't making suggestions. He was giving orders. Morgan turned to the head of artist relations. How many major clients have we lost in the past year? The man hesitated. A few. How many? Morgan pressed. A pause. 12. A murmur rippled through the room. Morgan nodded as if he already knew the answer. 12. 12 of our highest-earning clients walked away, and no one thought that was worth addressing? No one spoke. Morgan sighed. Effective immediately, I want direct outreach to every client we've lost. We will apologize. We will listen. And we will prove that this company is changing. More silence. Then, slowly, the head of artist relations nodded. Because he knew this wasn't optional. Morgan let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then he closed the folder in front of him. And one last thing. He looked directly at Ethan Cole. Leadership starts at the top. And if you want this company to survive, some of you need to decide whether you're part of the problem or the solution. Ethan swallowed hard. Emily looked down at the table. Matthew clenched his jaw, but for once, he said nothing. Because they all knew. Morgan Freeman hadn't come here to negotiate. He had come here to lead. And those who refused to change would be left behind. The rules had changed. The game had changed. And now the only question left was, who would survive it? The changes had been set in motion, but not everyone was ready to embrace them. Morgan Freeman knew that not everyone in this company deserved a second chance. Some people were simply too comfortable in their power, too resistant to change. And for those people, their time was up. It didn't take long for the pushback to start. Despite Morgan's clear directives, some executives refused to take him seriously. Emily Carter, head of talent relations, sat stiffly in a meeting days later, her arms crossed. Look, Morgan, she said, her voice laced with condescension, I respect what you're trying to do, but this industry isn't built on kindness. It's built on power. Clients don't care about respect. They care about results. Morgan leaned back in his chair, studying her. Is that so? Emily smirked. That's how we've always done things. Morgan nodded slowly. And how's that been working out for you? She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Morgan had his answer. A week later, a company-wide meeting was called. Morgan stood at the front, hands folded. The employees sat, waiting, but there was tension in the air. Because everyone knew, this wasn't just another corporate announcement. This was a reckoning. Morgan's voice was steady as he began. Some of you have embraced the changes we're making. You've stepped up, adapted, and shown that you belong in the future of this company. A few people sat up straighter, but others have made it clear that they are unwilling to grow. A pause. And today that ends. A few whispers rippled through the room. Morgan lifted a folder. Effective immediately, the following individuals will no longer be part of Hudson and Company. Then he read the names. The first, Emily Carter. She shot to her feet. This is absurd, she snapped. You can't just... Morgan held up a hand. Emily, you said it yourself. This industry is built on results. He tilted his head slightly. And your results speak for themselves. She froze because she knew he was right. Security arrived, waiting. Morgan gestured toward the door. You can either leave with dignity or you can prove why this decision was necessary. Emily's face burned with humiliation. But in the end, She had no choice. She gathered her things and walked out. One by one, others followed. Executives who had spent years playing power games, manipulating artists, ignoring ethics. Gone. The old guard? Falling apart. And in their place, something stronger was beginning to rise. The next day, the company felt different. Lighter, sharper, more focused. Those who remained had a choice: adapt or follow in the footsteps of those who refused to. Morgan walked the halls, watching the shift unfold. This wasn't just about firing a few executives, it was about sending a message. This company is no longer run by fear, he told his new leadership team. It's run by vision. And for those who still doubted him, they wouldn't be doubting for much longer. Because Morgan Freeman hadn't just taken control. He had rebuilt the entire foundation, and now it was time to see who was strong enough to stand on it. The old leadership was gone. The toxic power struggles had collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. And now? Now, Hudson and Company was finally ready to become something new. But change wasn't just about removing the wrong people. It was about building something better in their place. And Morgan Freeman? He knew exactly how to do it. The first step was to restore trust, not just among the employees who had been ignored for years, but among the clients, the artists, the partners, everyone who had once believed in this company and then walked away. Morgan gathered the new leadership team in the conference room. The tension was different now. Not fear, but anticipation. "We can't just say we've changed," Morgan said, his voice steady. "We have to prove it." The new head of talent relations, a sharp and insightful woman named Naomi Harris, leaned forward. "How do we do that?" Morgan smiled. "We start by bringing back those who left." A week later, Hudson and Company did something it had never done before. It reached out to the clients it had lost. The calls weren't about business deals. They weren't about contracts. They were apologies, acknowledgement, and most importantly, a promise that things were different now. Some clients hesitated. Years of mistreatment had made them wary. But then, the impossible happened. A legendary musician, one of the agency's most valuable former clients, agreed to return. "If Morgan Freeman is the one leading this company now," he said, "then I'll give it another shot." The industry took notice. And just like that, Hudson and Company had its first major victory. The internal changes were just as profound. The old office culture, where employees feared stepping out of line, where power came from intimidation, was gone. In its place, a company where ideas mattered more than egos, where interns could speak up in meetings, where talent was nurtured, not controlled. Morgan walked through the halls one afternoon, watching his teams work together, not out of fear but out of genuine belief in what they were doing. He passed by the reception desk where a young assistant greeted him with real enthusiasm, not because he was powerful, not because they feared him, but because for the first time in a long time, they believed in their leader. 3 months later, the numbers were undeniable. Revenue was climbing. Client retention was stronger than ever. For the first time in years, Hudson and Company was being talked about for the right reasons. At an industry gala, an old competitor approached Morgan with a smirk. "You really shook things up over there, huh?" Morgan simply smiled. "Change isn't about shaking things up," he said. "It's about making sure they never fall apart again." The company was stronger than ever, but the final test was coming, and this time, the entire industry would be watching. The transformation of Hudson and Company was undeniable. What had once been a cutthroat, power-driven corporation was now a place of vision, integrity, and respect. And those who had resisted the change? Most were gone, but not all. One afternoon, as Morgan Freeman was reviewing the latest quarterly report, a report that showed record-breaking success, there was a knock at his office door. He looked up. It was Ethan Cole, the former CEO, the man who had once dismissed Morgan. Now, he looked like a man who had finally understood the weight of his mistakes. "Morgan, I came to say something." Morgan leaned back, waiting. Ethan exhaled. I fought you at every turn. I laughed at you when you walked in that first day. And I let my arrogance blind me to what this company really needed. A pause. I was wrong. Morgan studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down, Ethan. Let's talk. Because true leadership, it wasn't about holding grudges. It was about creating a future where even those who once resisted change could find redemption. Through this story, we realize that real leadership isn't about control. It's about vision. Morgan Freeman didn't demand respect. He embodied it. He proved that true power isn't found in intimidation or status, but in the ability to create meaningful change. Those who resisted were left behind, but those who were willing to learn, to grow, to change, they were given a chance to be part of something greater. Because in the end, success isn't about who has the most power. It's about who uses their power to make things better.